In November 2020, a tragedy occurred on the outskirts of Overland Park, a small town in suburban Kansas City that at first glance might have seemed like an accident. But details gathered later uncovered a carefully planned murder, leaving police officers and medical examiners baffled. At issue is the Harris family. James Harris, 35, and his 32-year-old wife, Emily Harris, seemed like the perfect couple. They lived in a two-story house on a quiet street near the Tomahawk Creek Forest Parkway. James worked as a financial consultant for a major bank in Kansas City, and Emily was involved in charity work, helping needy families in her neighborhood. Their marriage seemed to be solid, and many neighbors and friends referred to them as the perfect couple. It all started on the evening of November 17 when James called 911. He claimed to have found his wife unconscious in their bathroom. He called calmly, though he claimed he tried CPR, but Emily showed no signs of life. An ambulance arrived on the scene within 10 minutes, but the woman was already dead when they arrived. Paramedics recorded the death at the scene. Police arrived at the house a few minutes after the call. At first glance, it looked like an accident. Emily was lying on the bathroom floor, head down, her body partially submerged in water. There were traces of blood all around her, but there were no obvious signs of violence on her body. The floor was slippery, as if she had slipped and fallen, hitting her head on the edge of the tub. James looked shocked, but tried to remain calm. At first, the detectives took what happened as an accident. They recorded James' statement, inspected the house, and took several photographs of the scene. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. However, one of the investigators noticed something unusual. On the bathroom floor next to the body were shards of glass that appeared to be too large to be the result of an accidental fall. James stated that after dinner, he had gone into the living room, and Emily had gone into the bathroom to take a relaxing bath. He noted that he heard a loud sound after a while, but thought it was just the sound of the water. When about half an hour had passed, James felt that his wife's time in the bathtub had dragged on and went to see if everything was okay. According to him, he found her already in that condition. The police began to examine the scene more closely. The house was neat, with no obvious signs of disorder. However, one small discrepancy alerted one of the detectives: the absence of wet footprints on the floor. If James was really trying to save his wife, he should have wet his clothes or left at least some moisture on the floor. However, his clothes were completely dry. The next day, Emily's body was sent to the city morgue for an autopsy. Upon initial examination, the medical examiner found nothing to indicate a violent death. There was a deep cut on the woman's head caused by hitting the edge of the bathtub, which likely caused her death. However, there were still questions that required further investigation. While the autopsy was being performed, police officers returned to the Harris home for a second look. The shards of glass on the bathroom floor now raised more questions. They were clearly not part of any object that could be easily identified. There were no broken mirrors or glass vials in the bathroom from which the shards could have fallen. This discrepancy prompted a more thorough examination. At the same time, detectives began checking the family's financial and insurance records. It turned out that 6 months before Emily's death, James had increased the insurance payout on her life to $1 million. This decision was made suddenly, for no apparent reason. In addition, a month before the accident, James also took out additional insurance policies that were activated in the event of Emily's accidental death. These financial moves aroused suspicion. James explained that it was a standard precaution in case something happened to either of them. However, detectives knew that such actions often indicated deliberate planning of a crime. A deeper investigation was decided upon. Neighbors and friends of the Harrises were interviewed. Many of them confirmed that James and Emily seemed to be a happy couple, but some mentioned that there had been conflicts between them over the past few months. Emily complained to her friends about growing marital problems, and one neighbor said he had repeatedly heard loud arguments through the walls. A few days after the tragedy, detectives received the results of a forensic examination. It turned out that the marks on Emily's body were not consistent with normal fall injuries. She had bruises on her wrists, as if she had been held by her hands. This indicated that the woman may have been abused before she died. There were also traces of strong sleeping pills in Emily's blood, which contradicted James' statement that she had been awake before going to the bathroom. The investigation began to delve into James's financial affairs. Many thousands of dollars in debts that he had carefully concealed from his wife and friends were established. It turned out that several of his financial transactions involved gambling and failed investments. All of this pointed to serious financial problems that James was trying to solve through insurance payouts. A week after the tragedy, police obtained a search warrant for the home. During the search, another key element was found. In a closet under the stairs lay a box of various chemicals. Among them was a substance often used in forensics to create tasteless and fast-acting poisons that cause drowsiness. Emily, according to the toxicology results, could have been poisoned by this particular substance. With each passing day, the evidence against James grew stronger. After obtaining a search warrant for the Harris home, Overland Park investigators began a detailed examination of the evidence found. The second week of the investigation uncovered more facts that only strengthened suspicions that Emily Harris's death was not an accident as originally believed. The focus was on two aspects: the toxicology analysis and the materials found in the pantry. Experts confirmed that the substance found among the chemicals in James's home was a mixture of sedatives that can be discreetly added to food or drink. The toxicology report on Emily's death indicated that her body contained the same substances in a concentration sufficient to cause her to lose consciousness. Detectives began looking into a possible scenario of the events of that night. They hypothesized that James had planned the murder in advance, using the substance to sedate his wife. After she stopped resisting, he staged her fall in the bathroom to create the illusion of an accident. James's testimony that he allegedly tried to resuscitate Emily didn't hold up to scrutiny either. Paramedics and forensic experts noted that there were no marks on her body characteristic of attempts at CPR or indirect cardiac massage. In addition, the lack of water marks on the floor and James's dry clothes increased doubts about his veracity. All of this led investigators to believe that not only did he not try to save her, but he may have planned his wife's death down to the smallest detail. In addition to the physical and toxicology examinations, James' financial records were an important part of the investigation. Detectives conducted an in-depth review of his bank accounts and discovered that James was mired in debt. Despite his apparent financial stability, he owed significant amounts to creditors. Large loans taken out on a house and car, along with losses on the stock market and gambling, were creating enormous financial pressure. Moreover, based on account statements, it appeared that Emily was unaware of her husband's real financial problems. Investigators concluded that these financial difficulties may have been the primary motive for the murder. A few days after searching the Harris home, detectives gained access to James's computer and smartphone. Analysis of emails, messages, and internet search history confirmed suspicions. James was looking for information about different types of poisons and sedatives, their dosage, and how to administer them discreetly in food. On the internet, he also researched mock accidents involving bathroom falls, head injuries, and ways to hide evidence. An email request James made a week before Emily's death was particularly suspicious. He was looking for information about the mechanics of bathroom accidents, including statistics on deaths from falls. Requests for such specific topics were considered highly unusual and provided a strong argument that James had planned the murder in advance. In addition, an autopsy of James's email correspondence with his insurance agent revealed that just 1 month before Emily's death, he not only significantly increased the life insurance payout on her life, but also specified the details of activating the policy in the event of an accident. The policy included a large payout clause in the event of sudden death or death by negligence, which could have netted James over $1 million. At the same time as analyzing the digital evidence, detectives continued to talk to friends and neighbors of the family. Gradually, a picture of a family life that was far from ideal began to emerge. Some neighbors mentioned that in the months before Emily's death, they had heard screaming and loud arguments coming from the Harris home. One of Emily's closest friends said that she complained that her husband had become emotionally detached and was often irritable. She also mentioned suspicions about James's financial situation, but did not fully understand the extent of his problems. A key witness was an employee of the finance company where James worked. This employee reported that James had discussed his financial difficulties with him and hinted at a quick fix to solve all of his problems. When asked exactly what he meant, James was evasive, but the conversation now seemed more than suspicious in light of what had happened. Having gathered enough evidence, the investigators began to reconstruct a possible murder scenario. The night before Emily's death, James had probably slipped a potent sleeping pill into her food or drink. When his wife fell asleep or passed out, he carried her into the bathroom. There he struck her on the head, probably using a blunt object, and left her on the bathroom floor. To create the illusion of an accident, James broke several glass vials and scattered the shards on the floor, faking a fall and subsequent injury. All the while, he was careful not to leave any marks at the scene that might indicate violence. His clothes remained dry, and he tried to maintain the illusion that he had come to the bathroom after everything had happened. However, small details, such as the absence of wet marks and glass marks, led to the initial version of the accident becoming more and more doubtful. While the investigation was underway, James tried to continue to live a normal life. He gave interviews to the local media where he talked about his loss and expressed his grief over his wife's death. However, his cold and detached demeanor in these interviews did not go unnoticed by journalists or police officers. Some of his answers seemed overly thought out and devoid of genuine emotion, which only increased suspicion of his involvement in his wife's death. By the end of the second week of the investigation, the police had collected key evidence: toxicology results, analysis of financial records, history of internet searches, and witness statements. All of this indicated that James Harris had not only meticulously planned his wife's murder, but also expected to receive a large insurance payout to cover his debts. The police were now faced with the task of gathering enough evidence to arrest and charge James. In early December 2020, the investigation into the death of Emily Harris entered a crucial phase. Overland Park detectives had gathered enough evidence to begin preparing for the arrest of her husband, James Harris. Over the past 3 weeks, police had carefully constructed a chain of events that pointed to his involvement in his wife's death. Now they faced the task of convincing a judge that the evidence was strong enough to issue an arrest warrant. One of the key elements of the investigation was CCTV footage from nearby houses, as well as James's movements on the day of the murder. Cameras from one of the neighboring homes recorded James leaving the house and returning a short time later. This was the period between dinner and the time he called an ambulance. During this time, detectives found that he had stopped by a local pharmacy store to purchase some medication, including painkillers and insomnia medication. Experts later confirmed that the drugs he purchased contained the same substances found in Emily's system. At the same time, a full audit of James's calls and messages over the past few months was conducted. These included encrypted correspondence with an old acquaintance who had a previous conviction for financial fraud. These messages indicated that James was planning not only to stage an accident, but was also devising ways to launder the money he expected to receive from insurance payouts. An acquaintance with whom he discussed his financial problems suggested several schemes to him, but their further cooperation was not recorded, probably because the contact broke down after Emily's death. In addition, an analysis of James's accounts showed several large transfers to closed offshore accounts. These transfers were made days before his wife's death, clearly indicating that he was attempting to hide financial assets and pave the way for flight if necessary. These transactions, conducted through shady financial channels, were also one of the key points in the construction of the charges against him. In parallel with the detectives' work, the Johnson County Prosecutor's Office was actively preparing the legal basis for the charges. The prosecutor requested a full accounting of the Harris family's life, including their financial and medical records. It turned out that James made numerous visits to private medical facilities where he ordered tests and consultations, including for his wife's health issues. These visits were suspicious because they had no apparent reason and were not known to Emily. Based on the evidence gathered, prosecutors concluded that James had been planning the murder long before the incident itself. His financial difficulties and huge debts, which he hid even from his closest friends, created pressure for him, which he tried to get rid of by any means necessary. Emily's death should have been the solution to all his problems, an opportunity to quickly get a large sum of money and start a new life. But his every move was carefully recorded by the investigation. Soon, a warrant was issued for the arrest of James Harris. Police officers decided not to make a public spectacle out of the arrest to avoid possible escape attempts or resistance from the suspect. In mid-December, in the early morning hours, several detectives arrived at the Harris home and arrested James on a charge of first-degree murder. He did not resist and kept his composure as he was read his rights. However, this calmness seemed to be further confirmation that he was prepared for this outcome. That same day, James was taken to the county jail for questioning. At the first interrogations, he refused to testify, citing his attorney. James was defended by a well-known Kansas lawyer who specialized in complex criminal cases. This move did not come as a surprise to investigators, as James had long planned his defense and prepared for a possible arrest. He pursued a strategy of complete denial and insisted that his wife had indeed died in an accident. While James's legal team built his defense, the prosecutor's office continued to gather additional evidence. Forensic experts finished analyzing Emily's phone, where they found messages indicating that she was planning to leave her husband. In those messages, she discussed her growing marital problems and her suspicions about James' behavior with a friend. This was further evidence that their relationship was deteriorating, and James may have seen this as further jeopardizing his financial plans. The forensic psychologists involved in the case profiled James, noting his narcissistic personality traits, tendency to manipulation, and cold, calculating nature. These characteristics could explain why he planned the murder so meticulously, but overlooked several critical details that ultimately led to his exposure. In the weeks following his arrest, the public followed the case with heightened interest. The media actively covered every step of the investigation, describing the details of the Harris family's life. James's reputation was rapidly deteriorating, especially after his financial problems and attempts to hide debts became known. However, the defense continued to insist that the case against him was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. In mid-January 2021, the first preliminary hearing was held. The prosecutor's office charged James Harris with first-degree murder, adding charges of financial fraud and attempting to conceal the crime. The judge ruled that the evidence gathered by the investigation was strong enough to proceed with the trial. James remained in custody as the court denied bail because of his flight risk. During the hearing, the defense attempted to question the reliability of the evidence, especially the data on the chemical composition of the substance found in Emily's body. James's attorneys argued that he could not have known about the presence of the substance, and that his purchase of the drugs from the pharmacy was accidental and related to general sleep problems. However, prosecutors presented evidence showing that James had sought information about sleeping pills and poisons beforehand, making his defense less convincing. Shortly after the first hearing, word leaked to the media that police were considering additional charges against James. It turned out that investigators had uncovered several suspicious financial transactions related to his previous investments and gambling. In reviewing these transactions, investigators discovered that James may have been involved in fraudulent schemes in an attempt to obtain money through shell companies. Questions about James' possible associates also became a topic of discussion among investigators. Evidence gathered during the investigation showed that he did not act alone in preparing some of his schemes. However, there was still no direct evidence of the involvement of others in Emily's murder. The prosecutor's office continued to develop the case, carefully preparing for the main trial, which was scheduled to begin in the spring of 2021. As the spring of 2021 approached, preparations for the main trial of James Harris were well underway. The prosecution had amassed a strong base of evidence, including toxicology reports, analysis of financial transactions, internet data, and witness testimony. Despite constant attempts by the defense to cast doubt on the evidence, the investigation was confident that it could prove premeditation of the murder and a self-serving motive. The Johnson County Prosecutor's Office realized that the key to success in this case would not only be to uncover James's cold calculation, but also to show the sequence of his actions. It would have to show the court that Emily's murder was the result of careful planning. The prosecuting attorneys laid out a chain of events beginning with James's financial problems, his search for ways to make a quick buck, and ending with a detailed explanation of how he orchestrated the staging of his wife's death. The trial began at the end of March 2021. James Harris, in custody since his arrest, appeared calm and collected. His attorneys continued to push the accident theory, arguing that Emily's death was the result of negligence and that James had no motive to kill her. The defense focused on discrediting the evidence, especially the evidence of the drugs found in Emily's system. The defense lawyers argued that she could have taken them by mistake or due to stress, and that James himself had nothing to do with it. However, the key point in the case was the presentation of the prosecution witnesses. One of the main witnesses was a friend of Emily's with whom she had discussed her marital problems in the weeks before her death. She told the court that Emily had seriously considered divorce and that her husband had become emotionally detached and cold. This testimony confirmed that there were serious problems in the Harris' relationship that James preferred to keep quiet about. Forensic experts provided a detailed analysis of how the substances found in Emily's body could have been introduced into her system. The toxicologist indicated that the concentration of the drugs was too high for accidental ingestion and that the substances acted quickly enough to cause unconsciousness within half an hour. The forensic expert testified that Emily's injuries could not have resulted from a simple fall. Based on the nature and localization of the injuries, it was concluded that the impact was intentional. This evidence helped the prosecution build a case that James had been planning his wife's murder for months. He researched toxic substances that could be used discreetly, bought drugs, and planned how the crime could be covered up under the guise of an accident. His decision to increase the insurance payout a month before her death only strengthened suspicions that he had been preparing for the murder in advance to cover his debts with the insurance payout. Key to the prosecution's case was the testimony of the insurance agent with whom James had contracted. The agent confirmed that James had increased his insurance coverage specifically for the accident and had several times specified details about how quickly the compensation would be paid after his wife's death. This proved to be a strong blow to the defense line, which tried to portray his financial actions as accidental and unrelated to the planning of the murder. Further, electronic evidence was presented at trial. Investigators scrutinized James's internet searches, correspondence, and forum activity. It was shown that he was looking for information on dosage of medications, as well as how to fake an accident at home. James's attorneys attempted to explain these searches as his curiosity and stress, but the overly precise nature of the requests and their timing were compelling arguments in favor of the prosecution. In addition, prosecutors presented evidence of James's financial fraud. He had transferred large sums of money to offshore accounts shortly before the murder, indicating his intentions to hide assets and possibly flee after receiving an insurance payout. This fact reinforced the notion that the murder was not a spontaneous act, but an elaborate scheme to solve financial problems. During the trial, the defense tried to portray James as a victim of circumstance. His lawyers insisted that Emily's death was a tragic but random event, and the prosecution built its case on conjecture and unsupported conclusions. They tried to question the qualifications of experts and the reliability of the evidence, but their arguments were not convincing enough in the face of the facts presented. One of the prosecution's final arguments was a psychological profile of James by invited experts. Psychologists noted his tendency to manipulation, lack of empathy, and cold-bloodedness in crisis situations. These traits, according to the experts, could explain his behavior and the indifference to his wife's death that he displayed immediately after the incident. This portrait of the defendant helped to create an image in the jury's mind of a man capable of premeditated murder for material gain. After weeks of hearings, the case came to a close. The prosecution had built a case that showed a clear link between James' financial problems, his actions to increase the insurance policy, and Emily's subsequent death. The defense, despite its best efforts, was unable to convince the jury that Emily's death was an accident. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a verdict. James Harris was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court found that his actions were premeditated and his motive was personal gain and the desire for a large insurance payout. The verdict was passed by a majority vote, and James was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The public actively debated the case long after its conclusion. The Harris case became one of the most high-profile trials of 2021 in Kansas, garnering both local and national media attention. The story of how a seemingly prosperous man became involved in financial fraud and cold-blooded murder to solve his problems sparked a wave of discussion about the motives behind the crimes and the nature of human greed. For the district attorney's office, the trial was an important victory. Despite the complexity of the case and the defense's attempts to construct alternative versions of events, the prosecution was able to prove that James Harris was not only guilty of murder, but had deliberately planned it long before the incident itself.